Hello, Sandra McKechnie here. It's not your fault or mine, but to remember, I want you to remember this. Together, we can do something about it. Stay tuned.
Voices of humanity, we need to hear your voices. We need to hear your voices.
Hi. Welcome, a very warm welcome to PR Connections Radio, the voice of new media. I am Sandra McKechnie, your host, a privilege to be your host. And this show is really fueled by double consciousness, two streams of thought, two social identities. We're going to get into that a little bit more as we go on. And it has everything to do with everybody, really. But I stay in my lane in terms of the people that came across the apartheid, transatlantic slave trade, descendants of the sub-Saharan trade, imperialism, all of that. And we honor our Indigenous brothers and sisters and so many groups that have been classified into so-called races. So we're going to look at that today. I just also want to encourage you to subscribe to the channel. We would really appreciate that. The content is great and things are going to get better and better. And we have a diverse amount of guests that will be coming on. Thank you so much. I'm going to read this bio of this amazing gentleman that we have with us today. I don't want to I'm not even going to say his name. His name's Michael, but he's going to come on and tell you his last name in a minute. He's born in South Korea, then became a part of the largest transracial diaspora of babies known to this date, also known as adoption. At 20 months old, I was sent to live in Minnesota, USA, a state that was 94% white and has the largest concentration of Korean adoptees. It's an estimated 22,000, but since the Department of Health didn't find it valuable to document international adoption data, it's hard to know the true numbers. Grew up most of my life feeling white on the inside, but was reminded I'm Asian or Chinese, as most white people assume, through prejudice remarks, threats of harm, discredited of existence, and simple ignorance. In 2005, I started dating my new wife, Korean and not adopted, and I started to realize I had another identity, my Korean identity. At that same time, I found my relationship with God. Everything that I knew about myself and the world completely got wiped from my mind, and it felt like I had to start from scratch. Who was I? Who are the people around me? What am I supposed to do with my life? Why do I have all this anger, hate, and resentment? Well, we're going to find out why. Michael, come on down.
Hey,
How
how are
are
you?
you? We've been waiting for this. There's a lot more in that bio, and I love that bio. I love that you're being so transparent in it. I really do. Michael and I met at a double consciousness training learning, and I don't think that was the first time. We've met before a
I
while back
think
when we
so.
started. We just
Mhm.
didn't have the connection. And I think on this one, I kept watching him and his comments. We had a few people, of course, in the training, and Michael, his comments just resonated, and I just felt such a connection to him. And this is, after all, the voices of humanity. And of course, video will show the faces of humanity. And I just thought, wow, we have all been classified apparently into races by some pseudoscientists. And Michael is on that rung. The Asians are on that rung, our indigenous brothers and sisters, blacks, and of course, who we may call the dominant group, and that may be Europeans. So on that rung, the blacks are at the bottom, yes. Michael is somewhere a little further up than us, but I wanted to really have him on because I wanted to hear his South Korean voice. And you heard in his bio, his Canadian, white voice as it is. And I want to just get into that, Michael. I
Yeah,
really loved what you had to say in that bio, and there's much more. Tell me about adoption. Tell me what that's like and how you got here.
sure. Well, international adoption really started to get big after the Korean War. That really became the start of a structured process, I guess you could say, or a lot of times what we call now is actually almost a business of of taking babies from one country and putting them into another, to put it plain and simple. And so after the Korean War, there's about 100,000, babies that were kind of left, or babies and small children that were left because their fathers had died in the war or families were died in the war. And it was a poor country. So
Mhm.
they had a lot of orphanages and they had a lot of different, daycare centers that had to be created. And then eventually, due to kind of one individual that was on I guess you could say it was sort of on a mission, is that they realized that there was a opportunity in their eyes to channel a lot of these orphaned babies into the United States. So the U.S. was the main country that became the recipients of this now pipeline of moving babies from Korea to the U.S. And so over the years, it's just formulated into being an actual structured, what again, it's mainly referred to as adoption. Um, but there's a big financial component that it turned into.
Wow.
And so other countries started to emulate this process. So there's China, Colombia, Vietnam, Kenya, Haiti, Russia, just
Okay. Okay.
all over. And so that's kind of where the origin of a lot of the international adoption kind of started from.
So the fundamentals of that, like, so when the GIs came, they came into and they bred with the women, right?
There was a lot of that. So there is a phrase that's called HAPA, HAPA, that is referred to a lot of the individuals that were born out of that, to where it was soldiers that went in, ended up, having kids with a lot of the Korean women that were there. And
Okay.
because obviously it was such a poor country that, there were different avenues in which people had to make money, and
Absolutely. So there were mixed race babies and there were Korean babies and mixed with Korean, white and is
correct.
that
There's a big mix of both. So,
right?
there's a smaller percentage of mixed babies. But because of the war, and then also just the society itself, if they had a child out of wedlock, or if the child had a disability, or if, there's a dozen different reasons on why a lot of babies were also abandoned. Um,
How long were you in Minnesota?
So I was adopted in 1979 and was there until 2015 when I moved to here, Toronto, Canada.
Okay, so how old you got adopted? You were adopted there,
Correct,
and
correct.
then your
Yeah.
family
So
moved. Wow.
right, right. So I was there for about 35 years, roughly about that. So
Was there a community there for you? Like, how did that work?
so it's pretty interesting. The city that I grew up in, there was about 5,000 people in the city. There was one Filipino family, there was one black family, and there were 16 adopted Asian kids.
Mm.
Most were Korean and one was Vietnamese. And so I grew up thinking that white parents and an Asian baby was normal because that's all I saw.
Okay.
And so it wasn't until junior high when I went to a city, or went to a school that was a little bit closer to the city, and started to see full Asian families. And I was like, whoa. I was like, this is different. I didn't know this existed. And then and junior high too, you're starting to figure out your identity and in general, but all of a sudden there's this other component to where it's like, whoa, like I'm looked at as being Asian now, or Chinese is what like I
I
said before,
know, I know. You
a lot
know
of
what? That's why you're on the show to help us all with our ignorance, because
we all got it. We all got certain ignorances,
right?
no matter what our ethnic
Definitely.
background is.
And all people on that rung in that those classifications, we and it's like we don't know each other. And I'm
Mhm.
just even speaking to you and meeting you, I realized, my gosh, I know nothing about Koreans or Philippine people. I know nothing
Mhm.
about Japanese people. So I think it's important to have all these beautiful nations on
Mhm.
on our show. Okay,
Sure.
so in terms of you were young enough. I've got this cat here, everybody. I know this is where life gets exciting. You have to throw. I usually put them away, but it's like, what's going on today? Anyway, You were young enough that you weren't one of the children that had experience being ripped from, like, knowing that you were being taken from birth parents.
Right, right. So when it was estimated what time, because there was no documentation when I was abandoned, so everything kind of had to be presumed or estimated. So I didn't have any paperwork. I went to the doctor. They do a checkup, and then they'd say, "Okay, you're roughly this old." You're so they estimated me to be about 15 months old when I was abandoned at supposedly an orphanage. I don't know. The unfortunate
Okay.
part is that they've fabricated a lot of stories as in terms of how we were abandoned or found. So a lot of times they'll just say, abandoned at an orphanage or a police station or something like that. But as we start to get more truths out of the story, we find out, unfortunately, it's alleyways. Unfortunately, it's garbages. Unfortunately, left on the side of the road. The truths of where a lot of babies are found and small kids are
Of
found.
course, of
Uh,
course. But
Unfortunately,
to make it, I guess, presented a certain way, it had to be.
yeah,
I
yeah,
see. I see. Wow. Have
yeah.
you ever had the desire to kind of do a birth trip, like how people go back? And did you want to look at that ever?
Yeah, absolutely. Actually, I did in 2017. My wife and I had decided that we were going to, well, we had always been planning to adopt, but the timing was for us to actually get going on the process. So we went to a meeting, and something in that meeting stirred up some emotions and feelings, and that was February 2017. And I just told my wife, I was like, I got to go back to Korea. I was like, I don't know why, but I got to go back. So I went back in September of 2017. Tried doing a little bit of birth search. Went to the agency that orchestrated the adoption, and again, without having any information, there really wasn't too much to go. They've got DNA testing, and they've got, you can go to different cities, city hall, you can do a lot of different things, but if you don't have any information to go off of, where do you really start? So just
You know what?
try to
Oh my gosh. I was watching something today about that, and it was and I got really emotional. I was like, oh my gosh, sometimes, like, when you're not informed, the world really does surround us, just
right, right. In
and
general, right?
right?
Yeah,
When
in
you get
general, we live that way.
information, you're
So
thinking, oh my gosh. And I think I said to you before, you're like, you're also a calendar boy for double consciousness, because talk about two streams of thought, two social identities, and
yeah.
having the desire. So when you went back to Korea, what happened?
Yeah, this is what's funny. When I landed in Korea at the airport, my first reaction was, "Wow, there's a lot of Koreans here." Like, that was my initial reaction. Because again, like, I had never been around that many Koreans. I'd never been in a space
Did you
where,
speak Korean?
no, no, I knew a little bit, like
Okay,
foods and stuff like that. But
incredible.
I was like, my jaw almost dropped. And this is the funny thing. When I saw somebody that was white or I saw somebody that was black, I wanted to be like, "Hey," I wanted to wave at them and be like, "Man, I'm uncomfortable too. Like, I feel out of place." And so it was
Double
almost like,
consciousness, everybody.
yeah, 100%, 100%. I felt so much more
Oh
comfortable
my
wanting
gosh.
to go up to talk to them and hang out and even be by them
Yes.
than be around, Koreans, which is such a weird. And then I'd been with my wife, already for 12 years and stuff. So it's not like I haven't been around the
Sure.
Korean community, but to be in an airport, solid Koreans, So that was the first thing that I was just like, wow. But then when I got into the city, got into Seoul, and I was just walking around, I had just gotten there, got to my place, dumped my stuff off. When I was walking around, I never felt so at home and out of place at the same time.
Oh, I hear you.
It was the weirdest, strangest feeling.
I mean, I really hear you.
Yeah. Yeah. Right?
Amazing to
Like,
me.
how do you put that into words, right? When you feel like the smells, it's so humid there, the sounds, for some reason, all of that was so familiar. But yet I had never stepped ground. It's a place that I had never been. Or if I did go through, it was what, 40 years ago, and I was a kid, and it was a different city, right? So,
Did people even attempt to engage you in the language or
well, they, because Korea is so homogenous, it's just like they would talk. It's it's not. It's kind of weird because in my mind I felt so different and out of place, right?
right?
But everybody else looks at me and just be like, oh, you look like everybody else. So
Yeah,
there's really no reason to engage because there isn't any connection, right? And so whenever I would go into a store, I'd go into a restaurant, they would speak to me in Korean, and I have to be like, "Oh, I don't speak Korean." But how do you explain that you don't speak to Korean to people that don't have a lot of English? So it was always really this awkward interaction, and a lot of times I didn't even say hello in Korean because I didn't want to start
a whole
a
conversation that you
conversation
could
where
have
I'd have
been.
to just be like, "Well, I don't know what you're
Yeah.
saying." Yeah. So
Wow. Oh
yeah.
my goodness.
So.
So when you were there now, you were trying to find, I guess, look for you
Mhm.
in the midst of all this. What
Yeah.
happened? What were you doing at that?
Yeah, so it was such a haze and a fog that I was in for that 8 days. Like I was just kind of moving through the city and the country, but I
Hmm.
wasn't really taking anything in because everything just felt like this weird fog that I was in. So I met with the adoption agency. On my paperwork, I went through a particular city called Andong, and I went through their city hall according to the documentation. So luckily, I have a family friend there. He drove me down to the city. We tried to connect with somebody from the city hall. When I would have went through, that old city hall was torn down, and there's a new one. And so there was no documentation there. They didn't have anything on file. There were a lot of orphanages in that area. Some had been torn down. The hospital that I had went to when I was first initially abandoned, that hospital's gone. And it was interesting because in the location of the old city hall is a monument, and this monument has small children by it, and it
Hmm.
has a mother that's pregnant. And in summary, it says that children basically are the future and need to be cared for, and need to be brought up in a way to be the future. And so I got to say I was a little angry when I saw that, because this is the city hall that also just passed a lot of babies through back in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, and till whenever. So it's just like, wow, you're so prideful of your children, but yet you had no
Conflicting,
problem displacing.
contradictory, right? Kind of
Yeah,
contradicts. Wow.
because there's an estimated 225,000
In
Korean
total.
kids that have been,
Yeah.
that's just Korean, right? That have been
Yeah.
displaced around the world. So
Incredible. Are you connected with a group of Korean individuals that are adoptees?
yeah, yeah, actually, very fortunately, there's a lot of different groups in the US, and then here in Canada, there's a couple groups. And it's sort of like a 6 degrees of separation type thing. Like you kind of know at least somebody through someone. And so there's a large number. So in the US, there's probably about 130,000 roughly adopted Koreans. Um, in Canada, I think there's an estimated 10,000 or something like that. There's really no way to know for sure. But there's definitely a lot of communities. Every year, there's usually big events. So I was just at one in Denver called KAAN, and there was about 200 and some, Korean adoptees that were there. There's a larger event called ICA. They usually have anywhere from 600 to 1,000 that attend that. And then there's smaller, groups and organizations in each different country and city too. So,
So when you're feeling, it's wonderful because I feel like in the last 6 years when I kind of woke up because I was sleeping, I felt like I was sleeping for a long time.
mhm,
The first thing I want to do is go back and get to know my people, embrace my
mhm.
people. Not, and some people take that to think, well, come on, we're good, everybody's good, just love each other, and can't we all get along? But in order for that to
That's
happen, I also need to know who I am,
100%. Yeah,
and
yeah.
obviously was your motivation to go to Korea, South Korea.
Well, and this is what was really interesting, and this even happened before I went to Korea. Is that I realized that I don't fit into the Korean community as well. So physically, we don't really fit into the white communities and the white culture. Internally, I don't fit into the Korean culture because I don't know the history. I don't know my bloodline. I don't know my lineage, right? I don't have the language. I don't have the cultural understanding. And
Welcome. There's a
so,
hug for
yeah,
you. Welcome.
yeah. Well, what's interesting is I've talked to a lot of like second gen, even second gen individuals, and they have a lot of similarities to that as well. They're born in Canada and they have Canadian culture, and the
Wow.
language
Yeah,
that they
that's true.
speak is. But I think where the different component is that we were raised in a white family, right?
Definitely,
And
definitely.
and we were raised in and usually most of the Korean adoptees were raised in more rural areas. So not, Toronto, we're so fortunate. We've got so many different cultures here, and a large number of different cultures and ethnicities here where, most of the adoptees, not even just Korean, are raised in, smaller towns and with very limited diversity in that. And so,
So even though, like, obviously you have a connection to your parents that adopted you, white parents.
mhm.
Like, if just for our audience, like, how what does that look like? Are you feeling when you kind of woke up to you wanted to find yourself? Was it like white on the inside, green on the outside? What did that
Yeah.
look like?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, it's interesting because I have so many traits from
Mm,
my parents. My personality traits are so much from my parents. So it's really like for me, I'm fortunate that I've got a good relationship with them, and they were very present in my life growing up.
yeah,
They had a lot of ignorance around the fact that I had to walk the world differently,
yeah,
but they were present, right? And they showed up and they, provided that love and care. Um, and so for me to be able to navigate the space with them and stuff, as long as it's around the white space, it's easy. It's no problem. But as I got older, I started to recognize the the prejudice that Asian people
mm,
face. I'd start to recognize the injustice. I'd start to recognize how Asian people and a lot of people of color in a sense were just get treated differently.
and how did you recognize that? Did things happen in school or when you went out?
You know what? Growing up, y- growing up, I got faced by it a lot, but because it was something that had always been present, you figure out how to navigate through it because one, my parents didn't believe me when I would tell them that I was getting chased or I was getting teased or bullied because of my looks. And a lot of times it was always just, well, just don't, just ignore them, just avoid them. It's like, okay, how do you do that in school? But anyways, and then when I would go to the police just kind of discredited what I was saying.
You went to the police? That must have
Well,
gotten
yeah, there were times where I'd be getting chased down the road. I'd be people that want to physically do harm to me because I'm not white, basically. And where I grew up, there were a couple different kind of white supremacy groups that existed,
yes,
and
yes.
so when I would go to the police, they would just be like, "Well, just try to avoid them. Don't say anything. You know,
Wow,
don't egg them
wow.
on." So I'm like, "Okay, well, I wasn't." But yet they
No,
still
definitely not. Not our Michael. No.
no. After they say something,
Yeah,
then
yeah, yeah. So,
but,
so were you feeling like you were toggling between, like, who were your friends? Were you with white friends? You know, did you, how was your relationship with black friends, Indian friends, Korean friends?
yeah, yeah. Well, it's really interesting because the majority of the people that are around you or around me were white. So
Yeah,
you just tend to have similar interests because
yeah,
of that, different sports and things like that. But then when I got in high school, that's really when I started to be engaged with people from different cultures and ethnicities. And so interestingly is that I found myself being more drawn and more comfortable around people of color. So I had a friend that was Liberian growing up. I had two friends that were native, I think Ojibwe and Cherokee. We just, I noticed that there was just kind of a more comfort of being around in public with them
Hmm.
than when I was with, a lot of my white friends. And so it was one of those that just I found the culture to be more amazing. I found the food to be more amazing.
Mm.
And I found just this desire, this attention to almost like a family feeling that we all kind of had because we were such a minority in Minnesota.
Wow.
But I still had, my white friends that I would do all my white friend sports with, like snowboarding and skiing, kind of all the stereotype, kind of white sports that we got, called growing up in that. And so I still had a lot of different groups that I could navigate kind of life with. And it was actually in high school that I met my first, non-adopted Korean friend, and I met her family, and I started to get, introduced to just Korean culture a little bit. And I felt like such an imposter that I actually ran from it. I didn't want to be around it because I
Around
didn't
what? The
around Korean culture. Yeah. Or
Wow.
around even
That's
being
not
considered,
common.
yeah, even being considered Asian. I hated talking about it because I didn't have anything to contribute. All I could say is like, yeah, I'm Korean. I know where it is on the map. That's about it. You know,
Wow. Like a Korean imposter syndrome. Oh my God.
100%. Yeah, yeah,
That's
very
incredible.
much so, very much so. And that's actually kind of common that is starting to be identified more in our Korean adoption groups is as people talk about it, it's just like, yeah, yeah, I felt
Oh
that.
my
That's how
God.
I felt. Yeah. And
So
so,
did the groups help you collectively when you'd meet from time to
oh,
time?
100%, 100%.
Oh, so nice. That's what a
It's like
feeling.
a friend of mine, she gave the perfect analogy. She
Mm,
was like, if you're vacationing or touring in another country
mm,
and you meet somebody and they're from the same country as you, you're like, "Oh, yeah, yeah, cool. I'm from, Canada too." And then you find out that they're from the same province. And then you find out they're from the same city. And then you find out that they're from the same neighborhood. That connection just builds more and more and more, right? Because you have more in common. You have more experiences that you can share. You can talk about, yeah, this restaurant? Yeah, I used to hang out at this park. When you find somebody that has that much commonality. So when we end up being out and meeting people, if we meet somebody who's adopted, oh, that's cool. If we find out they're Korean adopted, we're like, oh, you're Korean adopted. Oh, and you grew up out in the country. All of a sudden, there's all these commonalities that we can talk about, but not have to go into this full out explanation, trying to describe everything. And there's just that comfort that
wow.
exists. Yeah.
So that plus connecting with when you went to South Korea, that must have been like an incredible amount of feelings and emotions, all of that impacting.
Yeah, it was intense. Like it's so overwhelming. There's a phrase that in the specifically in the Korean adoption community, but I think it can be related to other international adoptees too, is what we call as the fog. So the fog is where you're just kind of floating in this space, and then all of a sudden, what we say is coming out of the fog is when we really start to say, "Hey, I'm different. Hey, this is different. Hey, I'm being treated this way. Hey, these people are actually really prejudiced towards us. Hey, these people."
Love you because we're so sympathetic, our peoples.
Mm,
Because the
mm,
fog, we might call it something else.
yeah,
We might call it waking up because you know what?
yeah,
For some
yeah,
time, you're just filing things because you just don't know
yeah,
what to do with it.
yeah.
And then when you do connect with other people like minded, it's like, this was real. No,
Hmm.
this is what was happening to me. I own that. That was hurtful. You know?
Yeah, yeah.
And there's
Well, and
something
that's a
else.
lot, and we didn't realize how much damage was being done from our families. You
And
know,
they didn't realize it either, I guess, of course.
No, I think there was some intentionality.
Yeah.
I know of several stories, which are several too many, and I know that there's 100 more. Is that, when you've got somebody in your family that doesn't look like you and isn't blood related, you start to treat that person a little differently. And so there was a lot of, unfortunately, there was a lot of stories of, and it's more so of women that were adopted into
Oh,
families and then being sexually assaulted and raped
oh,
by
I
family
see. That sort of
members.
thing. Oh my
Yeah,
gosh. Yeah. Not
yeah.
you're not talking about your parents and your parents' love and all that, but
No, no,
the
the
other
other the
components.
other side of the spectrum
I
of
hear you.
experiences
Oh
in
my
adoptive
gosh.
families. Yeah.
That's incredible.
Yeah, so that's, that there's a very big spectrum on the experiences or the adoption experience. And unfortunately, it's everything from, on the one end where, there's a lot of love and care and support and they try to do the best they can with the knowledge they have. Then there's the other end where the paperwork wasn't done and people were deported and now they're undocumented. They've been abused, sexually abused, physically abused. They're in their birth country, but they don't know the language or the culture. They can't get jobs.
Really
Some people have been, murdered when they go back because they don't know how to navigate that country.
incredible.
So they end up, being treated a certain way. And then get if you're out on the street, there's less value, unfortunately, that is placed on people and the value by the government. So,
I love the respect that you have um, for your parents. And I was listening to a couple of things earlier, and it was a young woman that said, I love a Korean, South Korean, and she says, I love my parents. I love my parents. But there's that part of me that they can't identify with, that I can't
mhm,
connect with them on.
right.
And that was this two streams of thought. It was
Yeah.
her heritage.
Yeah. And that's where, again, and we had chatted briefly about this before, is that it's almost like there's this triple consciousness almost,
Yeah.
to where, again, not by no means in the same origin of where the double consciousness, comes from, but that same sense to where it's like, okay, we have our consciousness that we need to be when we're in our white family or with our white
Yeah.
friends.
It's exactly the same.
And then we got, yeah, and then we've got the Korean ones where if we are engaged with the Korean community, we have to act a certain way and be a certain
Yes.
way. And
Yes.
then we have our true self of where
Which you
we're
have to pull together with all.
pull together or pull apart or try to create distance between the two of them because both sides have got their quirks and
Oh,
nuances that you don't
oh
want
my
to be
God.
part of.
I went to get this steamed milk, almond milk, and I picked up a muffin, which I shouldn't have had. Okay, but I thought of you. I'm crossing the street. It's just across the street. This elitist little coffee shop over here. Things are ridiculously expensive. I shouldn't say that. I won't tell anybody where I live.
I was just gonna
But
there goes your discounts if you're getting any.
really. And so I got the coffee and I'm doing what I usually do, but I caught myself in my double consciousness. So the person's going, oh, how are you? I said, I'm really great. Yeah. And, no worries. And I was like, ew,
Yeah.
who says no worries?
Oh, I catch
Talk
myself
about
doing that at times.
assimilation. We're going to stop
Oh,
saying that. So anyway,
yeah,
I, it was just the way I was navigating this
yeah.
whole, and
Mhm.
I thought, look at you. You're in your double consciousness. You're navigating your white assimilation right now. Right. And then when
Right,
I meet
right.
my family, during the year, because we are beige, just how, we talk like this. I just do it sometimes in trainings. We
Mhm.
just talk. So when I get with them, it's a different thing. And there's this dance you're always
Oh, yeah.
doing, right?
Yeah.
Oh my goodness. So I thought of you. I thought, yeah, he got some double consciousness. So
Oh,
you're working on yours. Oh my goodness.
well, we got
Oh,
that, a lot of, and I can just speak to Korean adoptees, but again, I'm assuming it's a lot of international adoptees. That whenever somebody meets us, so obviously if there's any communication through email and stuff, they're kind of, Michael Thielman. They're expecting, some German guy or something like that. And then I show up and then there's always this little look of confusion, trying to put it together. And then when I speak, because even when
pronounce
we
your last
talk on,
name. I got your last name wrong. I didn't even say it. What was your
oh,
last name?
it's
Sorry.
Thielman,
No, I
Thielmann.
got it written
So
down. And your
very, very.
parents are German or?
So my dad's German, my mom's
Okay.
Irish,
Oh,
so nothing like having German, Irish, and Korean
it
personalities in
must
the
be
same
fascinating.
space. Yeah.
Quadruple consciousness.
Oh
No.
my gosh. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. So, but so then when people, and then when they would talk to us on the phone or talk to me on the phone, they're
Right.
again picturing just some, typical probably white person. But then when they see me, there's all this confusion. Or if I see somebody that I've never met before and then I speak, it's always like, wow, your English is really good. And I'm like, well, yeah, I've been talking it for like 35, 40 years, like I should be. And
We
and
can laugh
so
at
there's
people. It's just,
yeah, yeah, very much so. And then, when the larger Korean adoption community comes together, it kind of blows our mind a little bit because we got people that are from like Germany or Sweden or Belgium or Australia. And so you got all of the accents that they have, but again, we all look very similar, but all of these different accents. And so it really is it's a beautiful thing, I think. Um, Unfortunately, there's been a lot more negativity that surrounds those differences, but I think it's a beautiful thing that really represents the Korean adoption community.
okay. So why do you think this might be a silly question? I'm just asking.
Mhm.
Why didn't you marry a white wife?
Well, I'll be honest with you. I mean, I didn't date a lot, but the little bit dating that I did, it was with white, with white women. And um, when when my wife and I first met, a lot of the Asian girls that I knew growing up, they I felt like, because I was telling you before, like I felt like an imposter.
Oh,
So I didn't want to be around something that made me feel like an imposter. Who wants to be around that space? So
yeah, yeah,
because internally I felt more Western, more, the white culture, I could just relate. I could just talk. There was just a lot more familiarity there. So I really had no intention of dating anybody, let alone seeking somebody that was Asian. Like there just wasn't that draw of trying to connect to my culture through somebody I was going to date. But when my wife and I met, we actually we got introduced, kind of through a mutual friend, and we emailed for 5 months before we even talked on the phone. I knew she was Korean. She knew I was Korean. She grew up in a traditional Korean household and culture, and she didn't want to date anybody Korean because she kind of knew the tendencies that a lot of, and this is generally speaking, but of what a lot of Korean men have when it comes to marriages, relationship, in-laws, families
yes,
mixing. And she's
yes.
like, I don't want to be a part of that. She's like, I'm not looking to be someone's second mom. She didn't want to have this expectation that she was going to be this submissive Korean wife.
That's a
And for
whole can of worms.
that's a whole different that's a whole different there's
People I love all day. That would be a great
yeah,
conversation.
I don't know if we got enough time in the
Oh
world
my
to dive
goodness.
into that one. But so when we started talking, everything was just through email. So we got to know each other in a very one-dimensional way, which was pretty rare. And this was all before, this was back in 2004, so this was before social media or anything like that. And then we just decided to be like, okay, well, you know what? We're starting to like each other. Let's maybe meet in person. And so there wasn't any influencing factor of our ethnicity or culture that contributed to us being interested in each other. It was truly just based off of our personality, our interests. We just clicked on a lot of, different topics and things like that. And once we started dating and being together, and she got more introduced to the Midwestern Minnesota culture, I got more introduced to the Toronto Asian Korean culture. We started to notice then where these differences between our upbringings contributed to how we just treated each other, how we treat family, how it's conditioned us, our own reflection of self-value. And so there was a lot of growth that both her and I went through. But again, it wasn't this intentionality of being like, I want to marry a Korean woman because of the Korean
Mhm.
culture that's missing in my
Right,
life. That,
right.
that, that wasn't it at all. Like I said,
Wow.
if anything, there was actually a hesitation to actually even get involved beyond just a friendship with anybody that was Asian, because I just didn't feel Asian. So I didn't feel that there was this connection, but they saw me and they're like, "Oh yeah, what about this? What about this? Do you eat this food? Do you do this? Do you do that?"
Oh
Which are
yeah.
all I'm
Yes.
like, "No,
That
no,
is so
no."
same because once you're assimilated here, we a lot of my people just didn't feel my group didn't feel black, and it was
Yeah,
hard, right?
yeah.
It was hard to connect to that. Now that I've And I don't know, I guess this way of, oh, yeah, it sounded like it happened to you too. When you were in
Mm.
the groups and stuff, you started making quite a connection on some level,
Yeah.
and that happened to me too in the last 6 years, I would say, where I really have been just connected to my group. And in this way, when you start loving yourself, because that has a lot to do with it,
Oh, it's
right?
huge. It's
Your
huge.
heritage and
Yeah.
your people out the melting pot thing. Okay, that's great, but
Hmm.
don't abandon your ethnicity.
Yeah.
That's part of you. That's why you behave how you do in certain things, right?
Right.
So
Right.
I
And
love
it,
that.
and I think that I think for some, and again, I'm just going to kind of speak specifically to Korean adoption, just because that's what I know most about.
Yes.
Most of my conversations is that it's hard to not have some anger attached to that because
Mm.
we never asked to have this life, and I get that
Keep it
Korea
real, Michael. Yes.
was a after the war they were very, very poor. I completely understand that, but when we think about how our culture was taken from us
Yes.
by
Yes.
nothing on our own, and with the approval and encouragement of our birth country, there was a lot of, this is going a little deep, but there was a lot of money that these different agencies in Korea were getting because they had kids that they were taking care of. So the government was giving them money for almost each child that they were taking care of.
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
there's a big issue of kids that were kidnapped, big issue
Mm-hmm.
of persuading mothers to give up their children. um,
Mm-hmm.
there was a lot of efforts so then they could have these kids who they would then be able to get money for, and then you had these adoption agencies in different countries that are paying money for these kids. So that's where all of a sudden it becomes a business. The
Yes,
international
absolutely.
adoption industry, back when I was doing my capstone in my graduate program, it was $1 billion a year business of taking children from one and in a sense selling them, to those that had the money, um, to the different countries, and then again supply and demand, as demand went up and the supply went down, all of a sudden you started to see where the pricing started to switch and change. And so there's the reality of what exists around it as well, that I think that as more truths come out, as we start to find out and discover our origin story, finding out how many, I've got friends that their family and siblings have been looking for them for the last 40 years, last 25 years. And
Really.
because yeah, and there's some that they missed being able to reconnect with their mother or family because they've passed away now, because we're old enough. So when those stories start to come out to where it's just like, oh wait, you're telling me that I was probably kidnapped from my front yard, and back then they didn't have any tracking system for
Right, right,
right?
right. Incredible.
And then obviously getting the truth out of these different agencies and stuff in Korea, it's just like there's a lot to be uncovered still, and
And you've never went down that alleyway trying to find your birth parents. Like it's a lot to uncover, I'm sure.
well, I did, but there's just it's just a lot of dead ends, as a lot of
Yeah,
us have. There's
yeah.
just if you got no information to go off of, like I have zero, like there was
Wow.
nothing with,
Nothing.
yeah. So the only
Mm,
thing, I've done a couple interviews, and all I've got is like a birthmark on my arm, and
really?
that's kind of the only thing that I've been able to say is like, well, if there's a rare chance that you had a child and you gave them up and they had a birthmark on their arm, I might be that person, and
Right,
the
right.
randomness of that is a needle amongst needles in a haystack.
So what's your resolve with that now within yourself?
I went back to Korea in 2019 for about 7 weeks,
Mm,
and it was a big turning point for me. So I had spent a lot of my life focused on what I didn't have, and that was a relationship with my biological mother, right? Just and then not having any biological family, no culture. Like there was such a fixation on that I was really missing out on what God had blessed me with in
Mm.
everything else that was around me. And interestingly, I did not recognize the value in the relationships that I've built with other Korean adoptees because we have this connection. And
Wonderful.
and really interestingly, I was sitting with my wife and we were having a conversation one morning, and she's like, "You know what? I'm surrounded by a bunch of blood related relatives and I'm not connected with them." And I'm sitting there thinking, I'm just like, hmm, you know, you have what I was searching for, this blood connection, this lineage connection, but yet I can't say that I'm necessarily going to have a deep connection with them. You know?
Hmm.
And it's just like, but I would have the choice, which would be nice, right? I'd have that opportunity to try to build that.
Why are you so connected to, like I was thinking, and I know the answer for myself, but I want you to put it in words. At our trainings, I remember just, we're just doing this training. It was like an 8 hour, wow, it's heavy. But it was a long time. That's how I felt. I know you guys felt it too.
Yeah.
Um, but and here we were, and Michael's in there in the mix, and people were asking questions, and then there was just this in myself. There was just sort of like I zeroed in on Michael, and I thought I need to get him on the show. Right? I want people to say yes, but there was something about it for me, and the way you connected, and the way there was a sympathetic sort of thing somehow with how I felt like you and I connected. So you seem to be very aware, like your answers, your questions. When at times it was a little bit of not infighting, but things were getting a little hot, whatever.
Yeah.
And you seem to bring some peace in the middle of the storm. Um, but so I wonder, you seem to have this intuition or this awareness when it
Mhm.
comes to what has happened to Blacks in terms of, multi-generational challenges, trauma.
Mhm.
So can you put that into words as to why you'd be that sensitive to us in that way?
I would say that it probably started back when I was in high school and I was friends with my good buddy Marcus, who was Liberian, and he was very dark skinned, and so that was the first incident, or that was the first period in my life where I started to see blatant hate towards him because he was Black.
Mm,
And then I also started to see how I got treated differently because I was Asian, but differently from him. So they treated me better than they
yes.
treated him,
Yeah.
right?
Yes.
And I don't think that that is unknown for anybody that has taken 2 seconds to look at how people are perceived in this world,
Absolutely.
right?
Yes.
And so when I started to recognize that and pick up on that, at a younger age, I can definitely say that I wasn't as much of an ally as I should have been, 100%. And then as I got older, right around in the early 2000s, I became really good friends. Who's now my best friend, and he's Nigerian. And through our journey through life together and hearing his experiences, I got even a deeper insight to how this
Mm,
has affected him as he's grown up and his family.
mm,
And and it
mhm.
obviously made me extremely sad to see that this existed. And then there was also the part to where it's like, yeah, people acknowledge that it happened, but then what? People go to protests, but then they go back, the people that aren't Black, they go to these protests, they get seen, they post whatever, but then they go back to their homes and go back to living their life in the color of their skin, you know, and people that are from the Black community still have to struggle and face the same thing. And then when I got into this job of the agency that I work for now, I've got
Mhm.
to be able to work with a lot of youth that come from different Black communities.
Mhm.
And so now I'm starting to get insight to the stories of what they grew up in, the systemic part of it,
Mm,
and started to learn, it's like, okay, so what am I going to do? Like, my relationship with God really started to reveal that I am here for a purpose. I'm here for a reason. I'm here to take my skills, gifts, talents, and opportunities to be a steward of that, to try to make a shift for the future. What is it? What do I do? And so as I went through that journey of just figuring out, okay, how do I take this program that I'm running? How do I start to instill that everybody is valuable? Everybody has gifts and talents. And how do I change that mind frame, not only within themselves, but within the agency, within the city, within, like, what is my
Mm,
part? And and I had to be really cautious to make sure that I wasn't becoming this savior mentality of trying to be this, this just doing it for myself, right? Like I didn't want it to become that. I had to do it because it was God saying, this is an opportunity for you to stand up, to be an ally, to say something, to advocate. There's these different opportunities that God just speaks to me and says, this is where you need to be. And so because of every little action that I've really tried to be intentional to follow, I'm learning and I'm learning and I'm learning. And I'm starting to see where now that divide happens, to where there's people that are advocates, there's people that say they're advocates, and there's people that like to be advocates but don't do the action. And the people that say they're advocates but don't do the action. It's just like, well, if you're going to say it, then you got to do some work. You got to show it, right?
I can't even imagine. You talked about being an ally, and I'm like, gee, you were too busy trying to navigate your own ally for your own cause. Well, I guess we have to be allies together. But
Yeah. It was
there's,
so necessary though,
yeah,
because it started to make me just be a more aware and conscious of what is going on around us. And so that's just kind of where it, and again, I'm always going to be learning way more than I can ever teach or ever give. And it's again, it's a necessity for us to learn. It's not, it
right.
really
Wow.
shouldn't be a choice.
We really need to. I'm seriously would love to book you for another show, and I would love to talk to you about that if you don't mind. I think it's
No, for
really
sure.
important. I think your voice is really important. And when we were talking about sort of how you connected um, with you know, um, people of color. Yes, you do, because you are a BIPOC, but I'm specifically blacks, indigenous to
Hmm.
the continent and in the Americas. So
Hmm.
it's like there is so much more to it, because so much that you're saying is the same thing. Very, very similar. I
Right.
mean, heck, and I had my birth parents.
Hmm.
Um, so I would really love people for us to delve into it a little more, because I think it's really, really important. And when you have vacations and you go out with your family, how does that feel? I can imagine. People have socio-economic sort of uh, how do I say, like, Asians in terms of that in the Americas, like, you guys are top,
Yeah.
but you're also, there's another whole group of you that there's some real disparities as well, right?
Right, right, right. And I think that that's always kind of it's always tough when you gain your knowledge off of like social media or the
Right.
news, right?
Oh
Like
yeah.
you're getting such snippets, and obviously they decide what they're going to show.
And there's no
Or
backstory for you to
no,
tell them
no, there's
yourself, right?
there's not there's nothing there, right? And I think that that's, obviously, with ever since with the pandemic and stuff, the image of Asians has shifted and changed, in which just the verbiage that's used. And we obviously know there's an uptick in the Asian hate crimes. And
Yes, I wanted to ask you to go into that a little bit, if you Asian
yeah,
violence. Yeah.
yeah, so with the violence there, and so there's such a wide spectrum of what it is to be Asian, growing up Asian in this country, in Canada and the US, and historically. And again, yeah, how each, different, even the different uh ethnicities within Asian culture, how they're viewed and treated differently. Is that, Koreans are generally, kind of perceived as being one of the more desired, especially with the way that the beauty products, and even in Korea, all the plastic surgery and everything. And then when the pandemic hit, all of a sudden it was just like everything was just China. It was just all this hate towards, the Chinese culture and Chinese people, and it was just fueled. It was allowed to be fueled by, you got the former president of the U.S. and you know
Mm,
everybody else that wanted to contribute to it, and then pretty soon it was just like anybody that was Asian was again a target, and
yeah.
didn't matter. And so I mean, yeah, there's so many different facets and
So
levels.
again, when you're out with mom and dad growing
Yeah,
up, and you're doing vacations, like,
yeah.
was that weird or was it okay? Did people looking at you funny? What was going on there? Like
Ah,
when you
we're
have to eat and
yeah, we had the white umbrella protecting us. When you're hanging out with white people, man, you get
drop
you
the
get
mic.
protected. You get protected by them. You get treated
Oh,
like
what a
them,
person.
and yeah, it's
I can't believe
it's.
you said that. Oh, sorry.
But it's the truth. It's just
I'm
I.
gonna take us off the air. Sorry, everybody. I didn't expect it. That's why I'm laughing. Michael, you're too.
uh,
But
well,
okay, we're going to go into a close now, but
sure,
I
sure.
really need, we haven't, I think there's just a whole show left for us.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
I'll talk to you about that if you want somebody else to join us, and we'll talk about what that could look like, because I think
for
it would be
sure.
really great.
Yeah,
You're
yeah.
amazing. Okay, guys, stay tuned. We've got a little something for you. Hi. Hi there, I'm Sandra McKechnie from Double Consciousness. Double Consciousness looks like this: cultural sensitivity, cultural awareness trainings. I've been doing it for 4 years. We're going into our 5th year, our 41st time on Zoom, and we're doing it. Would love you to join us. The next thing that I do is I'm a certified life coach holding space for clients in the areas of cultural awareness and sensitivity, right? So people that may have a challenge and they just want some space, a consultation, coaching opportunity to unpack implicit racial bias. Everybody's welcome, and we would love to have you in the trainings or book a consultation. And we have a free opportunity, 15 minutes, if you want to have a chat and get to know me and find out where you fit in that. The next thing that I do is I am a host for Voices of Humanity out of prconnectionsradio.com. If you want to be on my podcast and you're a fit, because it does have to fit with the show, has to complement the show and the network, I would love you to get in touch with me. And I'm also, from my heart, and I've always been a singer-songwriter, and I love this stuff. I love the singing. We put it in our trainings, our cultural sensitivity and awareness trainings. So sometimes I just sing just like this. You're all that I want. You are all that I need. And you brought me here when I can't find my way. You're all that I need. And you brought me here to pray. You should hear that with my keyboard player. It's to live for. Thank you so much for your time. I hope that helps you to know who Sandra McKechnie is. Take care. Bye for now. Okay, I hope nobody heard me. I hope Guy muted me because I was back here laughing out loud. So anyway, we need to laugh. Everybody, I'm not laughing at you, okay? Don't get upset. Actually, I'm on this platform with medium.com. I'm a writer on this platform, and I've got over 100 over 100 allies. A lot of them are just allies. They're white people that just are right in here trying to make a difference and coming up against this mess. But Michael, thank you. You're amazing. And I know we're going to have you back. In fact, we're going to book it because I think it's really important.
Sure.
This is one of the great voices of humanity. We're going to have a lot of others on here. This is Sandra McKechnie, and this is Michael Thamelin.
Philman.
Philman. Sorry.
Philman. That's
This is
okay.
Michael Philman, and he is somebody very precious to me. There's actually Dale was here, Marcia was here, and hopefully we'll have more from this
Yeah.
agency that we will not mention. But So grateful to have you. This was
Yeah.
enlightening. I want people to know and hear these voices. This is so precious. And there's a lot of these amazing adoptees out here that have gone through a lot. And I
Mhm.
need to hear their voice and how it looks, that have
Yeah.
double consciousness, reconciling two streams of thought, maybe three, three, maybe three social identities, and trying to find
Mhm.
that sense of self. And Michael, good job. Hey, subscribe to the channel. We would really appreciate it, and share. Thank you so much. Sandra here,
Thank
Voices
you.
of Humanity. Have a wonderful weekend. Say bye to Michael. Bye, Michael.
Thank you.